to the Support Person Seminar, COVID-friendly version. I'm here today with Greg Lauk and David Johnson. My name's Randall Wyatt, and we're just going to be talking to you guys today about support and stress associated with CRNA school. So one of the first topics we wanted to discuss was what are the common stressors that are associated with CRNA school, specifically for the student. The CRNA school is very time intensive, so a lot of time is spent studying by the student. There's also a lot of academic demands, both in terms of studying as well as participation in clinicals and preparation for all those activities. Another thing to consider too with CRNA education is that anesthesia itself is just an incredibly stressful profession in general. And so being new to that and like slowly coming to the realization that you are providing care that could easily kill a patient or have them have a successful surgery is a very stressful thing to approach as a student. Do you have anything to add to that, Greg?
Yeah, I think the stressful part initially is the fact that the student is coming from an environment where they're considered the expert, the intensive care, critical care environment, where they're now the student again, where they're placed in a position where they don't know everything. Typically, these folks that we take in the anesthesia programs were the go-to person in their respective ICUs. They were the ones that everybody looked up to and so forth. And then to come into a group of people where everybody was like that and where you don't know what you were doing is very stressful in itself. Many times what we see is people, when we interview, they'll ask these questions and we say it's very busy, or the person has had friends who have gone to nurse anesthesia school and their friends are like, dude, it's really busy, it's so much work. And they're like, yeah, okay, I can handle that. And then when they finally are in it, they really see how busy it is and what the amount of time that it takes to read material, to study, to spend time away from their homes. If they have families, that's now spending family. So it really does become a major stressor for people.
Yeah, that decreased ability to participate in those major life events outside of school really decreases for the students because you have that competition for time and resources between education and your personal life.
And so, Randall, when you think about what we've done to the family system, because again, as a nurse and as a family therapist, I lean into looking at that whole web. And a lot of times I tell my patients, um, I think of it as a spider's web, and I have an old farm porch, and in the corner of that porch on a summer's day, I look out and I see that big spider's web. And sometimes I'll go outside and I'll pull on just a piece of that web. And when I pull on a piece of that web, the whole web begins to distort. And so the family system is really part of that web. And many strands of that web get stretched, especially if you relocate and now your anchor is in a whole different environment. Um, Maybe there's financial resources. And so part of that web maybe even snaps or breaks or grows loose. And certainly, as a family therapist, we know that the bond between spouse or partners or couples is the most important piece of that whole web. And so if a lot of times I use the rubber band just to kind of stretch it, to indicate, how that is all connected. And humans are resilient. Nurses are extremely resilient. And we typically marry folks that are very resilient as well. But there are limits to this, and it will snap. And so for me, the stressors are anything that has changed. And I would say everything changes. Everything changes when a person goes back for a doctoral degree in nurse anesthesia. So
Mhm.
every piece of that web is stretched.
Said the web's a really good analogy. I really like that. We kind of addressed the areas of stress for the student, but there's also a lot of areas of stress for the support person, as you alluded to. One is, the change in finances. Sometimes the student was the primary breadwinner, or maybe they had a two-income family, and now the student's back in school. Like now, there's just the one income, or you're not getting any income at all. So there's some major life changes that come with that. Uh, there's also role reversals that tend to need to happen. Even continuing down that financial road, maybe the student was the one who managed the finances, and now they're no longer able to do that. So there's a lot of tough decisions that got to be made, and a lot of planning that needs to go into entering the CRNA education process.
And so with that, saying we know that support persons mitigate the stressors for the nurse anesthesia student. And so what do we do in terms of anticipatory guidance? How do we lean into helping that support system? And I love that you've kind of taken that piece on um, as part of your project, because the reality is, um, if we don't support that person, um, the spider's web will get stretched. And so I'm going to throw another analogy out at you, Randall, that I use
All
in
right.
family that I use in family therapy, and it's a puzzle piece. And on this puzzle piece, it has the word hope. And I know for me, anchors are really important. And so, how do we help that support person get anchored in new environments, especially if they've located to a new city? How do we help them get anchored in terms of resources? How do we get them help anchored in hope? Um,
Mm.
because couples make a decision to, and often see this as a great adventure, and it is a great adventure, but somewhere in the process of first, second, third, fourth year, however long programs take for people to get through, we sometimes lose our way. And so the puzzle piece reminds me, of life in general. And if I look at the shiny side of this puzzle piece, I don't have a clue. It might look like the sky, it might look like the earth, it might look like a flower, but it's part of something bigger. And so is
Mhm.
anesthesia school. And the hope is that when we're finished with this education, that it comes back to a bigger puzzle. It comes back to a bigger picture. That we don't lose ourselves in the process. We don't lose our family systems in the process. And we don't lose sight of what we were doing, what we intended to do by going on
Mm.
this adventure. And we anchor. And so, I've spent my career helping people with anchors, whether they're in addictions programs and we give them tokens, or we, are navigating through grief or loss, and we use all kinds of anchors, whether it's an anchor on our skin with a metal, or if it's an anchor in our pocket, or it's an anchor with prayer or reflection. But the notion of how do we hold on to things, and that's what I want couples to remember, that they're going to be stretched. But do they know other couples that have navigated this well? We need those success stories to give us hope. And that's why your program is so important. I can do that as a counselor. If they come and they access me, I can attempt to do that. But it's best lived with the lived experience. So for spouses, from my perspective, and partners from my perspective, can they look into the eyes of other people who have made it in that journey to say, yeah, we can get through this. We can make it to the other side. And I'd be curious, Dr. Greg, some of your perspectives on that, because your lived experience with anesthesia school, my lived experience with a PhD, I know that I looked into the eyes of my wife at one point in the journey and said, "Hey, babe, you're on your own. I I
Yeah.
I don't know how to do this."
Yeah.
And I did not have spousal support, and I'm pretty sure I traumatized my wife. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
As I hear you sharing that, because it's very valuable to have those things in place, like you just talked about, Dr. Dave. Before that, it has to be a shared decision, though. Okay, many times what we may find is the person that's going to pursue the doctoral anesthesia education, they're really gung ho because that's their personality. Their spouse may not be. Their spouse may not be comfortable with that 3 year loss of finances and time investment. And if that person is not on board and is not willing to walk with the student and cast that anchor, okay, or those anchors, then it's going to be very difficult, because life keeps going. Life doesn't stop because of anesthesia school. We see injuries, we see illness, we see loss of family members. We see, unfortunately, to this point, we see divorce. These are all aspects of life that continue regardless of somebody's decision to pursue this intensity of education. So the point ultimately is it needs to be a decision uh, for two people to make, and the support person needs to have as much information as possible before they make that decision, because the student, the CRNA student, or prospective student, they've done the research. They know, they've shadowed the CRNA in the OR. They've talked with friends in the ICU. They've done all this, and they share these things with the family member who may be a nurse, who may have some idea, but it still has to be a decision between the two people. If it's not, there's going to be a lot of difficulty.
To basically to piggyback on that, I know from my personal experience, it's easy to go into the education process, and it's easy to convince your spouse or whoever your primary support person is of like the rose-colored future of like, this is just
Yeah,
or maintaining that perspective. But what really happens is once you get into anesthesia school, you really kind of hit a survival mode where you're not really looking to the future or how this is just a one piece of that. It's more I'm just trying to get by day to day because of everything that's demanding my attention and all the stress that I'm having. And so it's really important to have those anchors that you were talking about, because those are things that keep you grounded to reality and to that bigger picture of like, this is just a small moment. I know for me and my wife, because we moved out here from across the country and we didn't know anyone, so it was really easy for us to drift into that survival mode and kind of get stuck in that survival mode because we didn't have those anchors to help pull us back into reality. And another consideration too was we thought of this as just being kind of like a step into the future. We were also hesitant to cast those nets or like to drop those anchors or spin that web out farther and make connections with people here in the area, because we're like, well, this is just a small, a pit stop in the rest of our lives, and we're not going to stay here. And the joke's on us because now we're staying here. But yeah, we had to get past that mentality of like, oh, why should we bother getting invested in relationships and the community if we're just going to leave in a couple of years? So
And I know you've leaned into resilient questions to me in the past, Randall, because of my work with marriage and family and couples. Um, and an acronym that I would want those spouses to know is the acronym of FALTS. And the word FALTS conjures up all kinds of things because of that stretch of that web. But if you think in terms of how the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain, kind of goes off wire when we experience fear, or we experience anger, or we experience a loneliness, of being separated from our partners,
Mm,
or when we're tired, the fault. I think to remember in terms of resiliency that we're experiencing a common a common process. I don't care how tight the relationship is. And I know that, Dr. Greg, you're absolutely right. The couple has to be committed together and go into this together. Um, but I don't think anything can really prepare us for the life force changes that are going to take place here and the tiredness of the student and the spouse or support person. It there's fear. Can we make it? There's going to be anger, and a bit of loneliness that's connected to that, and the tiredness or the hunger. You know, whenever we experience those strong emotions, neocortex goes out the window. And so I say the pause button, the other acronym or the other metaphor I use, huddle. We say in football we huddle after every play around a quarterback, and we regain perspective. And yet,
mm,
I would say to that family system around that web, how do they continue to huddle? How do they continue to look into each other's eyes? Not past each other's eyes. If the eyes are the windows of the soul, then how do you look into your mate's eyes and see their intense fear or their intense anger or their intense loneliness or sadness or grief? Because everything's changed. And to stay with it, to hit that pause button of the huddle, and also then to ask, I think the most important question in this whole journey is what's important now? I call it the win principle. What's important now? Because not every question's a good question, and we can put each
mm.
other on the defense. What did you do that for? Why haven't you done that? Why won't you do that? Versus looking into the eyes and asking a better question. What's important now in light of that we're not spending as much time together? What's important now in light of that we don't have the anchors, we don't have the support systems? What's important now for you today? Can I hit the pause button of the huddle just to spend a few minutes with you, having a cup of coffee at the kitchen table? So, I mean, those are the things I lean into for spousal support is huddling, making sure that we take time to come out of our thinking and overthinking minds and recognize that we go off wire when we're if have fear, anger, loneliness, tiredness, hungerness. Yeah. So that's what I lean into. Greg, what are you seeing, or what are you
Yeah, no,
thinking?
is you share those things, Dr. Dave. My wife and I, we've spoke a lot about this, and I actually brought this up to her last night. We were talking about it, and I said, what were the things that were the most stressful? And she said immediately the finances and the fact that you weren't there.
Mhm.
Weren't there from a not only many times physical standpoint, but also emotional, because I had to disengage in order to study and do a lot of the things that are required. Why do I bring that up? The reason I bring that up in it, and it goes along with what you just said, was that the concept of time management is so important for the student to develop a good time management plan, so that on a Friday evening, hey, let's go have dinner, let's go for a hike tomorrow, let's go do something together. Those are things that are very, really very simple type of things to do to spend that time. But if I have, as a student, hanging over my head the fact that I haven't studied enough for my advanced principles and anesthesia course, then I'm not going to be there mentally and emotionally for that person on that hike, if you will.
Yeah, well, and again, that's why I push up that pause button from a resiliency standpoint, because Dr. Greg, I couldn't agree with you more. And I remember those times where I did carve out time to spend with my wife, and yet I wasn't present.
Yeah.
I was so in my head with
Yeah.
fear
Yeah.
that I hadn't studied enough. And I was angry that I was in the middle of this path and didn't know that I would finish. And I was tired. I was absolutely exhausted. And so, for me, priming the pump of the brain with intention of coming to my senses, all of my senses, when I am with my spouse on that walk. And I love the idea that you chose, a hike, because I think sometimes when we think of mindfulness, we think of a yoga mat. And I love yoga and I love Tai Chi and those meditative practices. But with our spouse, the notion of the environment, what do we see? What do we hear? What do we touch? What do we taste? What do we smell in real time to come
Yeah.
out of that thinking and overthinking and worried and obsessed brain that we live in when we're in school? So what's important now is
Yeah.
that I connect with you in the presence,
Yeah.
not abstractly. We're on a walk and we're paralleling. You're
Yeah.
in front of me, I'm behind you, and we're not in real time. How do I get in real time with you in real space so that you feel my presence for sure, even if it's short periods of time,
Yeah.
and that support. And that's where I also think spouses who are living this experience, Randall, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of, when you said you and your wife didn't put down anchors, so to speak. Um, I think one of the critical things are for spouses to have anchors with other spouses,
Yeah.
that are living that experience, because it's lonely.
Hmm.
Greg, when I
Hmm.
talked with my wife, I know she was lonely.
Yes. Yes.
And, I didn't have the energy. There were times when I couldn't give what she needed,
Yeah.
but she had a sister, she had a mother, she had a good friend, she had God, she had other anchors that could help her during those dark moments because I wasn't available.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I wasn't always available when I was present
Yeah.
because I was in my head.
Yeah, that's I would say that is one of the most valuable things for the support person is to have those resources available to them, whether it's a support group, church group, friends, family. Once we take the time to get to know people and so forth, it makes it easier. But having that those things in place that he or she, that support person, can have discussions with other people. It really helps. It really helps.
Hmm. Throughout my experience, the time where my wife and I have had the least relational strain is when I treated it as a job, where I dedicated, from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. is school time, studying,
Yep.
classwork, etc. Like those were the times where we did the best. And what happened was I've noticed is when I'm not being very purposeful about that and practicing that mindfulness, is that school easily encroaches into that personal time that was supposed to be spent with my wife and other family members. And then too, once you start going to clinical rotations, and traveling and things like that, it really kind of chips into
Yeah.
that goal that I had of treating it like a full-time job. And so that stress really starts to follow you home, especially if you're not being purposeful with it.
And so to connect with what both of you are saying, I know here at the University of St. Francis, we have a student assistance program, and most colleges and universities have an SAP. And the unfortunate thing is that sometimes the students and the support persons, in particular, the support person doesn't get information about the SAP. And yet they would benefit from sitting down with a counselor, looking into the eyes of the counselor. who does that, who knows the lived experience, and the loneliness and the tiredness of this journey, because they've made a career out of looking into the eyes of students and spouses. And so I would lean into that. That would be a critical juncture for any kind of support person to mitigate some of those stressors, is to have that neutral counselor person, because that counselor is going to come up with all kinds of ideas to lean into
Mm.
that couple. The notion of writing notes to each other, to set those boundaries or those limits, to invite practices such as mindfulness or meditative skill sets. I mean, they're going to do all kinds of things that the couple may or may not have thought of.
Mhm.
Um, and the counselor is often rooted in the community, so they're great to brainstorm. Such things
Mm.
as where to go to church or
Yep.
synagogue or temple, or where to find a meeting, a support group meeting that might be of help. And so, maybe they're the first friend of the spouse. So I say, the student assistance program at any college and university, and of course, at the University of St. Francis, we have that person right on our own campus. And so, to make sure that those students have that name and that number of that counselor, for accessing, would be helpful.
Hmm.
I-
And not even just having access to those professional services, but also, like you guys said, there's an importance to sharing with others who are living the same experience. So spouses talking to other spouses, or other family members who are having to go through the same thing, or who have gone through the same thing, in the form of more of a mentor relationship. Because it's the same thing that students do every day when they meet up together. They share stories with one another and the stressors they're just going through. So important just to vocalize those feelings, because it helps you
a
process
sounding
those
board,
thoughts. Yeah,
a
yeah,
sound,
sounding board.
you know. Yeah,
Yeah.
really. I think that's important for that to be available for not only the students, because the students tend to have that camaraderie. I think comes to my mind is a sense of belonging or a sense of community to
Mm,
have
mm-hmm.
for not only for the student but for that support person. And what if there's, obviously St. Francis, we have these things available. Um, what if the student, the school that they may be going to around the country, they don't have that available? Another option, especially if the support person is working, is employee assistance programs through their employers.
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up, Dr. Gregg, because, again, some of those programs are a bit hidden.
Yeah,
And so you have to actually ask, oh,
yeah,
do we have an EAP?
yeah,
And it's like, yeah, well, what's the number or what's
yeah,
the website? And
yeah,
do a little bit of digging. But once you've made that phone call, it opens the student or the family system up, for all kinds of resources, maybe for that spousal and that spousal support, but maybe the kids,
yeah,
depending on how old the children are here. They're part of that web as well. And
yeah.
I know for me, I had 6 kids, and I felt like I missed a whole chunk of their high school
Same
years.
here.
And, so having that support in the form of an EAP, was helpful as well.
Yeah.
So expanding, once you're done with school and you're getting into the anesthesia practice, what resources would you guys recommend once students get out into professional practice, both for the practicing CRNA and for their support person or their spouse?
I would say for the CRNA specific, there's one specific resource. The AANA has a wellness group that focuses on a lot of the things that we've talked about: stress management, substance use disorders, financial issues, counseling issues. That the wellness aspect through the AANA is available to students as well. So if you call the AANA Wellness, they will say, what state are you in, and so forth, and they'll send you to that person. The other thing would be the employee assistance programs. We talked about it from the standpoint of the spousal or spouse or support person in their own working environment. However, the CRNA, oftentimes they're going to be either employees of a hospital or employees of an anesthesia group. And those EAP programs are also available. So it's a matter, like Dr. Dave mentioned earlier, of knowing where to go, and because sometimes they can be hidden, or if we're in the midst of a crisis, we don't always think about those things that are available, right? I feel stuck, and I may need somebody to help kind of pull me out of the muck and say, hey, listen, this is available to you.
You know, no one comes to a counselor on a great day. You know, mostly people access counseling or therapy when when it's not a good day. And I would say, again, from a resilient perspective, you know, couples who are graduating, that celebration of we're moving on to the next thing after anesthesia school, that would be a good pause point. Just like you had premarital counseling, and maybe you have pre spousal support going as you go into anesthesia school. I think coming out is a great time to hit the pause button and say, who can help us? And
Yeah.
maybe that's a priest, or maybe that's a counselor, or maybe that's a minister, or a good couple friend who's a few years older, about that space of, okay, how do we come back together again? And what are the things that we need to do to continue to build our web of strength? And we in healthcare, we talk about illness prevention and health promotion, but the majority of us wait until the body is fatigued and diseased before we access services. And so I would say to the couple, access resources before the rubber band snaps. The reality is there's lots of great resources, and the EAPs are worth their weight in gold. And now that many of them are hosted virtually, you're able to access some of those resources at a distance. So it makes them extremely accessible, and those folks are dialed in to help navigate the next part of the journey, the next piece of the puzzle that we don't know what it's going to look like either.
I would add that just like the discussion of, do I go to anesthesia school? Are we going to do this together? What kind of job now do we want? Because you can choose a job that's essentially Monday through Friday, banker's hours, and make less money. Or you can choose the job where you're working 80 hours a week, okay, on call, away from the home for 24 hours, and making good money to do it, but you're sacrificing the time. That's a very important discussion to be had before graduation, months before graduation, because you may take a job and the money is like, man, I'm going to be making, really good money, 6-figure income, and life's going to be so much better. And your spouse may say, but I want time. I want time. I want you home for dinner. I want to be able to take that nice vacation. And I want you to be, the word that continues to come up that you two have both shared is present. I want you to be present because the anesthesia job is stressful. And Randall, you alluded to some of those things. We do lose patients in the OR, not patients as far as our own individual, but patients do die in the OR. And that is a huge emotional burden. So that takes us back to those wellness resources that are available.
Mm-hmm. I would also, on that point, emphasize when you're looking for those jobs to look for what kind of mentors are available in that practice that you're joining. They have the lived experience that they can share with you and help you through those times where you're really struggling. I would even emphasize that for the spousal or support person too. It's really important to have those mentors in your life as well as those peers going through that experience. Peer assistance could be in the form of a Facebook group where everyone is able to get together and ask questions and empathize with one another on the experiences that they're going through. And also the ability to get together, meet and intermingle. It really helps to foster a community where everyone it personalizes the whole experience and allows people to become more invested in it and really maintain that perspective, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that concludes this seminar, unless you guys have anything to add. We talked about some of the common stressors that are associated with the CRNA education process, both for the student and for the significant other or the support person, both in terms of what's involved with the educational process, as well as those stressors associated with moving and role changes and loss of support systems and those anchors. We also talked about resiliency and how it can be promoted. And we also addressed a lot of the resources that are available both for the support person and the student and future CRNA.
Thanks, Randall.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Great
all the
topic
information.
and valuable in the long run, I believe, for a lot of people.
Great. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay.